Welcome to Next Week, Last Night. I am your host, Stuart Johnson. Thank you so much for joining me today. Boy, do we have a great show in store for you. My guest tonight, Uncle Sam. He's a little hungover after all the 4th of July celebrations last night, so he's decided to crash here until he feels a bit better. Also, tonight, we are looking to answer the question, why do women come on to men and then ghost them? Answering this question with me is no one, because I couldn't get a single woman to agree to doing the show with me. So I'm going to have to answer that question myself. But first, a recap of the week's news. And you know what? It's been a bit of an SSDW, hasn't it? Same shit, different week. I mean, Corona's back. It's taking the United States of America by storm, kind of like the Beatles did back in the day, except probably even more contagious. Of course, Donald Trump insists that really, if you want to get rid of the corona, just stop testing people for it, because if you don't test people, you can't have any cases. It's sound logic from the president. I'm not gonna lie, good logic. The only problem with it is the part where people start dying. That's a bit of an issue. Speaking of people dying, there has been another wave of incidents of police brutality against peaceful protesters, black people being found hanging from trees all across the country, a United States military service member was found dismembered in the aftermath of her speaking out against sexual harassment in the military. It's been a really sad, depressing week for the United States. Kind of like this whole year, really. Not a lot of good. This has probably been the most depressing 4th of July since 1864. I mean, it's pretty bad. But that's okay, because we're here to brighten your week and give you the top quality, high-tier journalism that you're looking for, which brings us to our main story tonight, outrage culture. Now, if you remember last week's episode where we tackled the false reporting of sex offenses and whether or not it's a real issue or rape apologist propaganda, one of the jokes I made was that I was fully expecting that episode to get the show canceled, and as much as it was very much a joke, because you need to have an audience in order to actually get canceled, there was an element of truth to what I was saying. We live in a modern-day society where one bad joke or one bad tweet, or in the case of this show, one controversial episode, can very much get you canceled. And this is the result of a phenomenon called outrage culture. Now, for those of you who don't know what outrage culture is, hi Mom, outrage culture is a phenomenon by which people take something someone said or tweeted or wrote or whatever, and then use it as material against them to have them fired or lose their sponsorship or just ruin their reputation. Now, oftentimes, these are attempts to damage a person's character, and oftentimes we're dealing with things that were said years and years ago. Now, that isn't always the case, however. Not all instances of people saying something incredibly racist on Instagram or Twitter and people getting upset about it is a case of outrage culture. If someone says something incredibly offensive and hurtful on social media, you have every right to get upset about it. For example, an example of something for example, take the Roseanne Incident. Someone who said something incredibly racist on social media and who had their show canceled as a result of that racist thing that they said. This was not a case of outrage culture. This was a case of someone being, I don't want to say punished, but let's say have consequences suffered for saying something incredibly stupid. Because even though free speech is very much a thing in America, consequence-free speech isn't. You can't punish someone for saying something, but you can refuse to work with them. So that is an example of someone being reprimanded for saying something racist in an instance that wasn't outrage culture. So what is an example of outrage culture then? Well, take the Gunn incident, for example. Anyone familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe or comic book films or just movies in general will know the story of what happened to James Gunn. Basically, a number of years ago, I believe it was 2012, James Gunn posted a series of tweets that were, well, let's say, edgy to say the least. They had some pretty hurtful stuff in them against women, against pretty much everyone. Now, it is important to note that these tweets were meant as a joke, and it is even more important to note that since then, James Gunn apologized for making those tweets, stopped making those kind of tweets, and then moved on with his life. Except in 2018, 6 years after he'd made those tweets, in an effort to ruin his reputation and in an effort to launch a smear campaign, someone dug those old tweets up and used them as material to demand James Gunn be fired by Marvel Studios. And they got their way. James Gunn lost his job at Marvel Studios over tweets he'd made 6 years ago at the time. Tweets he'd apologized for and stopped making in the interim. That is a classic textbook example of outrage culture. You want another one? Take the Kevin Hart incident, for example. When he was picked to be the host for the Academy Awards a couple of years ago, a bunch of people dug up an old joke he'd done in one of his bits, in one of his stand-up shows, that was a little homophobic, even though it actually made fun of Kevin Hart's own insecurities more than it made fun of gay people. But still, there was a hint, a tinge of homophobia to it. And this launched a whole smear campaign against him of people demanding that he come out and apologize, which he refused to do because A, that joke was years old and he'd stopped doing it, and B, he'd already apologized for it once before. And so he quit his job as host of the Academy Awards over all that outrage. And there's more examples I could bring up, but the basic gist of it is as follows. Someone makes a joke on social media. No one gives a shit. Then years go by. Then suddenly people start to give a shit. And then they retroactively go back and punish that person for something they said 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 years ago. And it is very much a common occurrence. Now, sometimes they will do this over concurrent jokes. PewDiePie's had this happen to him several times, where once he said the N-word in a live stream and it almost ended YouTube because studios and companies started pulling their sponsorships en masse. Even though he apologized for it and explained himself and never did it again, it was enough to, well, it was almost enough to just ruin YouTube. Outrage culture, unlike the false reporting of sex offenses, is a pretty common occurrence. And it is something that a lot of people, especially on social media, have to be very, very wary of. So, now that we've established that it is in fact a real issue, although it doesn't always apply, again, if you say something incredibly racist on Twitter, people have a right to be upset about it. It's just a fact. But I'm talking about those specific instances of people deliberately stirring up outrage in an effort to get someone canceled. Hence why outrage culture is also called cancel culture. What can be done about it? Well, on the one hand, here's the thing. On the one hand, there is a personal responsibility on you, the creator, the person making the tweet, making the joke, making the post or the video or whatever it is you are making. A lot of people, too many people, are not aware of the consequences of posting on social media. They think they can just post whatever the fuck they want and get away with it because haha, free speech. Let me make this clear to you. I've already said it once, I will say it again. Free speech is not the same thing as consequence-free speech. You cannot be put in prison for something you said. But that doesn't mean that other people have to put up with it. If your boss sees a tweet that's incredibly racist that you made, that boss has every right to fire you because they don't want to be associated, or they don't want their company to be associated with a raging racist. So be careful about what you post. Think twice before you post it. I do the same thing, believe it or not. I know sometimes some of the stuff I say can be a little bit out there, but I do pay some mind and some attention to the things I say in these shows because I don't want people looking back on it and saying I did something, or that I was a racist or a homophobe or a sexist. So really think twice, especially if you are a celebrity or a public figure of some kind. Please think twice before you post anything. In fact, if I had my way, all of these celebrity types and public figures, they would all have some kind of social media manager whose job it would be to proofread and check every single one of their posts before they post it to make sure there's nothing controversial and nothing potentially offensive in them. One of the downsides of being a public figure and being a celebrity is that A, you are held to a much higher standard than everybody else, and B, people are really, really happy to see you fail. So that's the first thing. Be careful about what you post. Think. Because once it's on the internet, it's pretty much there forever. You can delete it or try and hide it, but someone somewhere is going to find that stuff. Think twice. That being said, not all of the responsibility should be on the creator. There also needs to be a responsibility on the side of the viewer. For one, we have to stop punishing people for things they said years ago. If I made a tweet a decade ago and no one had any problems with it back then, you shouldn't be able to go back 10 years, find that tweet, and all of a sudden be super offended by it. Because here's the thing, this is not like Kevin Spacey or Harvey Weinstein or Roger Ailes who sexually harassed people and then kept it hidden for decades, and then now we've found out and now it's a big deal. Social media posts are public. You can see them. You can read them at any time. So in the case of James Gunn, for example, those tweets he made, they weren't hidden. They weren't some dirty little secret he kept in his basement. Anyone could have read those tweets and everyone was fine with it. You had your chance to be outraged by what he said 8 years ago. You don't get to go back now and hold his feet to the fire. It just doesn't work like that. When it comes to social media posts, you have one opportunity to be outraged, and that's when it's posted. If you weren't outraged then, you don't get to be outraged now because now it suits you and now you want to see them burn. So just stop that shit. Stop digging up people's old tweets. Stop launching smear campaigns and stop holding them accountable for opinions they had nearly a decade ago. Because I'll tell you what, you look at some of my opinions that I had from a decade ago, I'd be a completely different person to who I am today, and I know it's the same thing for all of you guys. Go back and see some of your old social media posts or your old political views from 10 years ago and tell me if nothing's changed from then till now. We as human beings should be allowed to grow. We should be allowed to develop. We should be allowed to change. In fact, isn't that the whole point? Isn't the whole progressive movement built around change, around progress, people evolving and moving forward and learning to accept new beliefs? Isn't that the point? I thought it was. So why are we punishing people for things they said a decade ago that they've apologized for and that they've stopped doing? Just very recently, a YouTuber, I forget her name, which sucks because I've seen a couple of her videos and she's great. I believe her name is Jenna. I'll double check that once I'm done with this show. She has been forced off the platform. She's been forced off of YouTube for jokes she made years ago, at a time when her political opinions were very different to the ones she has today. And her channel has been ruined to such a degree that the poor girl has decided to quit. Even though she changed and evolved and grew and moved on from that, she is now being retroactively punished for opinions she doesn't even have anymore. What the fuck is the point of that? Why are we punishing people for changing? So what? You're damned if you do, damned if you don't? If you do learn to change, well, fuck you, because you still had those opinions back in the day. And if you don't change, well, fuck you, because you still have those opinions. It's horrible. And all it does is stunt people's growth and stops people from accepting new views or changing their opinions. So please, number 2, stop doing that shit. Stop digging these things up. You want to dig up whether or not someone raped someone 15 years ago? Fine, that's a criminal offense. But what I posted or what you posted or what someone else posted 8 years ago is not fucking relevant. Because culture has changed. There are jokes you can make today, or there are jokes that you were able to make 10 years ago that you could never ever make today. Simple as that. A lot of the jokes that I'm seeing people get punished for these days were perfectly acceptable back in the era when they were made. Because society evolves. Society evolves. I've run my mouth here plenty on this topic. As you can see, it's a topic I take quite seriously, and I think it's time, before I go on too long, I think it's time we turn to someone who might have a little bit more knowledge on the topic than me. So please join me in welcoming our senior New York correspondent, one of the most liberal and progressive people I know, who should be more than well informed on outrage culture. Please join me in welcoming senior New York correspondent Sven Johan Vengerson, or as he's more commonly known by his initials, SJW. Take it away, my dear friend. Liberal propaganda. Liberal agenda. Liberal. Bunch of liberal bullshit. Liberal. Barack Obama. Wow, that was so liberal, I can feel my sperm dying. Wow. Okay. Sorry about that. Jeez. Where were we? So great points, excellent points, SJW, and thank you very much for your insight. And really, I mean, he makes a really excellent point, and that is, there's a real problem, and I'm gonna delve into this more in another episode, maybe even the next one. But there is a real problem in liberal America, and really, I mean, not just America. This is a problem I've seen in liberals everywhere. A real issue of creating an atmosphere where people are afraid of being punished for what they say. And I don't mean like being punished for having racist views, because that's fine. I'm talking about people being scared to speak freely because they're worried someone will take and twist what they said and turn it against them and punish them for it. There's a dangerous side to liberalism and progressivism that we don't always see. A side where people are forced and scared into following these opinions blindly out of fear that they're going to be called a racist or a sexist or a homophobe if they don't. Where people are pressured into nodding along and agreeing with everything the other person says because they're scared if they don't do exactly as they're told and if they don't respect the party lines, that they could have their lives ruined by a smear campaign. Outrage culture is dangerous because it takes away from all the good work that liberalism and progressivism is trying to achieve. Social justice is a noble cause, but when it poses an active threat to people's livelihoods because they have to worry about whether or not they're going to be punished for a joke they made 8 years ago, then there's something wrong there somewhere. And it needs to be addressed. For a party and a group that's all about inclusivity, there seems to be an aversion to certain differences of opinion that's kind of scary within the liberal part of America, and that manifests itself in outrage culture, amongst other things. Again, we will talk about this more. But outrage culture is a symptom of that. And it's used by people who oftentimes don't even give a shit about the problem at hand. They just want an excuse to ruin this person's life because they don't like them or whatever. So this is a serious issue. Make no mistake. I mean, all jokes aside, this is a real issue. One that needs to be addressed. And one that I urge you, because all of you watching this, I know you use social media. Please, please watch out for this kind of thing. Don't get caught doing it, and don't let other people get away with it. Stop punishing people for things they said a decade ago. Things that they have apologized for. Because you are ruining the lives of people who have genuinely tried their hardest to change. And that's wrong. Speaking of wrong, I suppose that sort of segues us into the sponsor of today's video. This episode of Next Week Last Night is brought to you by, you guessed it, Taco Bell. Taco Bell, for when you don't have money for Chick-fil-A. Well, that pretty much wraps up today's episode. There is a third point I wanted to raise, and this goes to all of the employers watching this video. First of all, hi, thank you for not hiring me as a result of watching these videos. But also, please, when you're hiring someone, because we live in a digital age these days, and circling back to what I said earlier about these posts being public and easily accessible, when you're hiring someone, please, please, for the love of God, check their social media history. See what they've posted. Make sure you know what they've said in the past. And then, if there's anything controversial, make sure you speak to them about it to see if it's a recurring issue or something that's no longer a problem. Because one of the most bullshit things in this whole scenario is the fact that, for example, Disney hired James Gunn even though they knew about those tweets he'd made. And then suddenly they tried to retroactively go back and fire him as if this was new information. Well, hold on a minute. You hired the guy. You should have known that he'd said these things. And by hiring him, you said you were okay with them. So you can't go back on your word now and pretend that you're outraged. Make up your mind. So when vetting a candidate for a job, make sure you check their social media history and then decide if there's anything controversial, are you still willing to hire them? If the answer is yes, then you have accepted the fact that you are okay with the things that person said. And you cannot now go back and fire them for saying those things. Or just don't even give them the job in the first place. Either one of those works just fine, but it has to be one of those. Don't be a hypocrite and then hire them and then fire them when suddenly those posts or tweets come to life. Or come to light, not to life. God, can you imagine if tweets could come to life? Man. Oh, some of the sleazy, sexy shit that I'd have brought into the world. Anyway, my kinks are the subject of another video. Thank you. Oh boy. Now I'm going to get canceled. Thank you so much for joining me, ladies and gentlemen, in this episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please, if you know any other examples of outrage culture, if it's happened to you or if you have any opinions on it, make sure to post it in the comments section below. I've been your host, Stuart Johnson. It's been another great show. I've been really happy to talk to you all again. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these videos. We have new episodes coming out every single week. Like I said, I've been your host, Stuart Johnson, and I will see you all next week. Good night.